What's up, interpreters? This is Kathryn Leann Harris with Interpreting Sports. Excited to be with you all today.
What's up, interpreters? This is Heather Minier, your corporate engagement and sponsorships manager for NAI.
What is up, interpreters? This is Paul Caputo, Executive Director for NAI, talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I think people who know me know that I am a sports fan. For me, particularly, that centers around baseball. But the whole notion of interpreting sports and how sports fits into our culture is really fascinating to me. And so I love, Kathryn, that your company is called Interpreting Sports. I mean, how cool. It's all front and center right there. I want to jump in with what I think is pretty basic question related to the work that you do. What differentiates the interpretation of sports from the interpretation of other subject matter?
First of all, thank you. It's great to be with you both today. And Paul, I'm excited to hear your enthusiasm for the topic. And this is a great question because sports is different in very specific ways from other topics that we interpret in public spaces. One of the things that makes it so different is that it is so very present. There's a huge invested interest in sports that comes with a very big price tag, both for individuals and corporations and brands and teams. And it also takes up an enormous amount of cultural real estate. So sports is sort of ever present. It literally is in the backdrops of our lives, in our living rooms and in restaurants. You know, it's always kind of around us in our communities. So there's this enormous presence about it. And as a historian, I've had to really sort of ask myself those deep questions about how does the past inform the present, and specifically when we're talking about sports. So the past does inform the sports present. The sporting past does inform the sporting present. And it does in that much of what has happened in the modern sports era, which is part of the reason why most of the interpretation that we see of sports is so recent and present, because the modern sports era is very recent, the late 1800s, just sort of post-Civil War here in America, but in a lot of the world, when we get into sort of the way we're doing sports now and this big business that we have, that's all fairly recent. In America, the story around that modern sports era is the history of it. We've not evolved dramatically away from kind of where it began in the late 1800s. So the past is actually very present. It's very much still the landscape that we're living under now. And so, so I think that in a way makes it very similar to a lot of the things that we interpret, and then in other ways makes it different and unique. This invested interest that we see in sports comes from a lot of different angles. Fans, coaches, athletes, participants, brands, teams have enormous invested interest in the way sports is told presently and the way those stories are told. Again, maybe that's different than other topics. Maybe it's not. I mean, people are very invested in how politics is interpreted. I mean, history is, something that we culturally tend to be really invested in because it does inform who we are now, our identities, our memories, our present. With sports, because there's so much money behind it, you've got this these marketing arms that are coming off of teams that are museums, and they kind of are marketing arms, or they definitely are in many cases. And that is different for museum professionals and public historians and interpreters to think about what are the limitations of that, of telling a story that has behind it a giant marketing engine. There are limitations involved with that. The other piece to that is because the modern sports era is so modern, the people you're writing about might literally be reading what you're going to say about them, or a close relative, a generation or two removed. And we know that does have an impact on what we say. If you know that somebody's going to show up and read what you've written about them, it probably is going to shape somehow what you say about that person or that team or that moment in time. And so that's another piece that makes it different. And then I think that the other unique thing about sports is there is this big, fun, celebratory, and I'll add in at this point commemorative, although I think these two are different, but there are these aspects of sports that sort of seem to take up most of the real estate. Um, and we contend that it doesn't feel like sports if it's not celebratory. That needs to be there. And at the same time, there's some gaps happening within those frameworks. And that was really what we sought out to answer. When we started this research, we were looking at this particular aspect of why are we seeing these celebratory and commemorative heavy exhibits that they do feel a little top heavy. They feel like they're missing something. They don't feel as grounded as maybe some of the other museum exhibits that we see. Why is that happening? And that makes sports really unique as well. And the last one is that sports are inherent to the human experience. Its play is as inherent to the human experience as eating is. We have to move our bodies in order to function. And so to what degree do you do that? Do you do it alone? Do you do it in groups? Do you do it professionally? You know, but we all do it somehow. And so there's something here that's so inherently human, and therefore it reflects all the different aspects of society. It also is been a tool for control and power within our culture. And I think that what we've found, and we can get into this more, maybe the other questions, but is that there is something really unsettling about the way we're talking about sports right now, given that it is so inherent to the human experience. And that's the thing that we really wanted to research, and that we spend most of our time kind of digging into with our clients and in our work and with the way we talk and educate about educate museum professionals on this topic. It was a long answer.
Well, and I have 1 million questions as follow-up here.
So do I. Now, I'm curious, you mentioned the gaps, maybe the gaps in the stories that were being told in museums. And those gaps, can you talk just a little bit more about that? Is that sort of where the deeper history of these exhibits, and that's what you're kind of talking about, the interpretation at that point?
Yeah, and to qualify again, a lot of what we're looking at is the modern sports era, although sports have always been around. So what I'm about to say is sort of connected to this American modern sports era centric view, but I think it's also goes far before that, far beyond into the past before that. And then any culture can look into the power dynamics of sports and how that informs how we talk about it and what we talk about. So it does get deeper into the history. What we found is that when the modern sports era began, marginalized groups and of all kinds began to figure out that they could play sports and they could win. They could do it well. It was this equal playing field, and that they could get societal power. They were starting to get some societal notoriety and maybe influence out of that. When that happened, we're looking at like America post-Civil War era. White men unified across class lines to change the playing field so that they were the only ones who could play and win. And that was happening at the same time that in American history, we see the elite propagating this, untruth that America was an equal playing field on which anyone could play, and the best men won and therefore got the most power in society. And that wasn't true. So we have like this, as that began to happen, this gaslighting started both in that way and also with sports, where they began to say, look, there's no politics in sports. There's nothing to see here. Look away. You're making this up. You're saying that we're doing this thing, but we're not really doing this thing where we're taking over the playing field. That's not really happening. So I'll connect those dots real quickly and just say what's really interesting about that is that's our current day. That's the current day argument. You know, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, one of the first arguments was get politics out of sports. Well, that's an outdated, very old trope that like we're still living under, believing it's present, but it really was born right, you know, in the post-Civil War era in America. Because of that, because so many people were eliminated from the playing field, their stories are also not available. They're not been researched. They've not been researched well or properly. They're not told. And often when they are, they're told as inclusive to the already existing white male dominant narrative, but still telling it through that lens. So the gaps are many. There's actual gaps in the historical record. There's a lack of agency from the people who might want to tell the story of their people and how they were affected by this. And there's also some gaps like in how we understand that historical record, because if you only look at statistics, first of all, what's going to happen is if you only look at win-loss records, all the people who weren't allowed to compete aren't in those records. They're not there. So the model we currently have is the Hall of Fame model that is based on win-loss records and based on this white male dominant narrative. So it's the also rans, it's the, oh, and right. And then there were also at the same time, there were, you know, African Americans who were doing things in sports. So there were women who were doing things in sports, but you're still telling that through the other lens. And they weren't allowed to compete, so their stats aren't going to be there. And even if when they did compete, in many cases, they competed and played better and were more successful than their white counterparts or, you know, white cisgender normative heterosexual counterparts. If you start to tell those other stories, you need to dig into the stats more. This gets into some of the methods that we look at. The gaps are also in understanding what those statistics represent. How big was the playing field? How many people did they have on a baseball team? Because we all know that like pitchers only have so long that they can play. So if you have fewer pitchers, you know, how long did your pitcher play? How many times did he have to play versus what the white teams were doing? Well, then the stats are going to be skewed and different for a lot of reasons. They might have more games on their roster, or they might have played fewer games. You got to really dig into the data to start to figure out how to fill those gaps.
You're describing an experience to a T that I had. I have visited the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City 3 times. It's an amazing place. What's amazing to me as a white baseball fan to go there was to learn that Negro Leagues baseball was a success story. Yes, it was born of oppression and discrimination, but the Negro Leagues teams were among the largest Black-owned businesses and really important parts of Black communities. And the integration of Major League Baseball happened in such a painful way, and in particular to these teams. You know, it was the integration of Major League Baseball that did away with, you know, with these successful Black-owned businesses and huge parts of Black communities. Anyway, I don't mean to go down that rabbit hole. I could talk about that all day long, but I was prompted to think about that. You know, on your website, you say that your stated goal is to recenter the international sports conversation around empathy, balanced humanity, and authentic connection. It reminds me of my experience at the Negro Leagues Museum. That was really a human story. It's an American history story. It's not a sports story. So I'm wondering, you know, what that means when you say empathy, balanced humanity, and authentic connection.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I'm holding my heart because, you know, first of all, what you just pointed out is the way that sports have been part of liberation movements
Mm.
in this country. They're very impactful in the liberation movement, the Black liberation movement, women's liberation movement, LGBT. You know, the LGBT and sports story is something we're still really unpacking. And within that, if the idea there is, well, you had to go create your own thing because you weren't allowed into the normative. Okay, but to go join the normative, you now have to tear down the thing that you built that you really love for all these reasons. And I think you really landed on, yeah, one of the ones that's just such a sort of heart-wrenching story of these communities that had built up around the Negro Leagues that then had to go through this overhaul in the name of, those power dynamics and competition and um, playing in society in a different way. But wow, what if that had gone differently? If we could go into our magic history machine and reimagine the past, what if instead of saying, look, we've built up the teams and we're going to be kind enough to let a few of you come join over time and and the cities aren't going to welcome you, but okay, we want to do it. What if that had been a collaborative experience that acknowledged what they had built and brought some of that along? And what if that's what had happened? And so that was a great entry point into our tagline, which means acknowledging that there are human beings playing these games, and those human beings are um, fun and complex. Sports are fun and complex, just like the humans that are playing them. That there's this light, fun, energetic part of sports, and there's also this really complex, challenging, unsettling part of sports, just like the humans who are playing in them. And I believe in order to honor athletes and participants and coaches and fans, the best way to do that is to honor their whole humanity. And so that means getting out of the God villain paradigm. That's a start. That this, like, we're either going to love you or villainize you. You're either Peyton and Manning, who's just squeaky clean and amazing, did all the things right, or you're like Pete Rose, and so we got to drag you through the trenches, right? And so the Hall of Fame model offers some challenges to breaking this down. The Hall of Honor model might go a long way towards solving the problem. But getting out of the God villains paradigm, getting out of the win-loss paradigm, and with that, I think acknowledging that celebration and competition and commemoration are always going to be part of sports. It's not doing away with them, but it's balancing them with the socially relevant component and being willing for that socially relevant component to be ugly sometimes, to talk about the hard things. We believe that if you really love a sport, you also advocate for it. And advocating for it means talking about the things that might do it under, talking about the things that are hurting the sport, that, will kids keep playing football if it's going to hurt their brain and mothers stop letting them play? Will we see a drop in the sport? How do we make the sport safer? But if we don't talk about those things in public spaces when the issues are real and people are being affected by them, we're doing a disservice to the sport, to the people playing. We're creating an unrealistic expectation. And then what we end up with is people like Simone Biles who have to self-advocate in even a small way. I mean, there's like worlds of things that haven't been said about her story because there's not really space to do that. And so what we think is if we can bring some empathy to that and balance humanity, this authentic connection to what's really going on, then we can begin to let players and participants and fans really tell the deeper stories that make them human. And we can start to make sports something that's a more welcoming space for everyone. I also think it means welcoming the non-fans. And I believe that if we write exhibits that non-sports fans will come to, we've won the day. If you can write something that acknowledges there are people that don't like sports, organized sports. They might like to go run themselves or play with their kids or maybe they play on like a flag football team in their community or something, but don't like organized sports. And there are reasons for that. There are reasons why people don't like it. If we give them a voice, if we talk about the why behind what we do with sports, and give them a space, and also don't assume that the visitor knows everything. I think that's a really soft, empathetic way. Right now, a lot of sports museums are written for the fans, but you have
Mm.
to have a certain batch of knowledge to even show up to that museum and certainly to understand what's going on inside of it. So I think that really means like don't just assume that the visitor remembers that time that the greatest game in your team's history happened, because they might not. A quick anecdote, I had a meeting with a colleague recently who went to a sports museum, went to a football museum with his son, and his son's a big football fan, and he's not. And so he was like, it was great because my son was energetic and excited, and he could tell me all the stories. And we need that. Like with that part needs to be there. The like what makes the fan so excited needs to be there. It's part of it. But he left and he got a book called How Football Explains America, and he read that book, and he was like, now then I was really into it because I understood why my son cared so much about football. Could that be the exhibit? Well, yeah. Like, yeah, it could. Let's make exhibits that help people. Or I had a friend who said to me, I'm not into sports because I was bullied in high school by the athletes. And so I've just turned away from sports. And I was like, okay, so what if I could make you an exhibit about that? That's the idea. Like, let's really look at the impact that sports has, why we care about it, and explain that to people, not assuming that everybody's just coming to the table with an inherent knowledge about all the things. And then mine your fan base for the stories that, that they know, because they know things that no one else does. That's another key part. Let them show up and be excited and play and feel like they're at a game. I think that's all part of the balanced humanity piece.
One of my most interesting sports museum experiences was I was in Japan, and I went to the museum for a baseball team called the Hanshin Tigers, with a friend of mine who was a huge Hanshin Tigers fan. And all of the exhibits were in Japanese. All the videos were in Japanese. All the display, I mean, the whole thing was, there was the language barrier, and there was the fact that I was only very vaguely familiar with the history of this team. And it was a team that had not had a lot of success. So I could relate on that account because I'm a Philadelphia Phillies fan. But it was a really interesting experience to only have the visuals and the videos and the sounds without understanding anything really of what was going on around me. And it still walked away with a sense for, yeah, I can appreciate what these fans have been through. It's amazing how much they were able to convey.
I like immediately want to do an exhibit where that's the experience. And the purpose of it is, okay, we're going to take out one element of the game day experience. See if you can figure out what's going on. Okay, why can you figure that out? What is it about this experience that speaks to your humanity and your there's something like you just know, like you can feel what these people. I would just let that would be fun, right? Ask them why is that? Why do we all know that? What's going on here? Tell us what's happening in this game.
Yeah.
But then I'm sure there was a lot that was lost because you don't know the context. So that's the other side of it. What do you not know? What can you not see? Yeah.
Kind of want to bring it back to interpretation because what you're talking about so much is like universals that we talk a lot about in interpretation, like play, right? So people might not be interested in sports, but everybody knows, hopefully, how to play and other universals that you could bring in. So I guess, how did you find yourself in interpretation, and how did you come across this field and realize that that was important in what you were doing?
Yeah. I like to say that it found me. Um, and in many ways that's true. I stumbled into it. I was raised a sports fan in a place where sports is religion. Was raised in Alabama. So college football is religion. There'd always be a sermon at church, like leading into the football season. Every pastor in the South's got this why you should not start worshiping football next week and continue worshiping God sermon. They've all got one of those. And we would all go like worship at the college football house on Saturday and come to church and worship on Sunday. So that's the world I come from, and it runs really deep. And I come from a big sports loving family. My parents, extended families. So I think it came to me naturally, but there's a lot of people that love sports in America. That's a lot of what we do. We have over 600 sports museums in this country. And that was some years ago. So we probably have more than that now. Biggest in the world by a long shot. Long shot. So, I mean, I was, I don't know, born an American, but I studied history, in college, and then and then went at an SEC school because I wanted a football team. And then I went into another field for a little while and went into business, and then was like, I think I want to go back into history, and went to find a museum to work for, called every museum in Birmingham. And the one that was hiring was the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame. And I walked into their museum for the interview, and it was like I saw the answer to a problem I didn't know existed 10 minutes before I saw it. And I was just like, why do I know this? Like, where's this coming from? And I've basically been following it ever since, and just, started to see, often people say, like, write about what you know, but also very particularly write about what bothers you. And things just started to bother me. I started to notice how we're talking about sports, and then began to really examine, like, who I am, and the qualifiers on me, that the intersectionality of my life as a white, middle class, cisgendered woman from the South. How does sports intersect with my life? And then how does it intersect with other people's lives? And what is it I'm seeing about this that feels like I can't relate to it? And why is that happening? Well, I'm a Boston marathoner, and the first woman who could run in it was 1972. And the woman that ran the first time, who broke in as a bandit, was sent a letter by the BAA telling her women are not psychologically capable of running that distance. Well, that's part of the reason why I don't feel represented. So I began to just really dig into the historical record and look at what was bothering me about how sports was interpreted in public spaces. And I think that's how any of us come to something. It's like the thing that I love, it isn't loving me back the way that I'm loving it. And wow, that hurts. That doesn't feel good. And I want to do something about that. And then I got a public history degree, and everywhere I go, I started going to visit sports museums, and just did, just years and years and years of field research. I couldn't stay out of them. And began to notice the patterns and what was missing and how rampant that was. And started to ask deeper questions and find people to come along the journey with me, and try to convince people that this was a thing that mattered, that took some time. And within all of that, the nugget is really that cultural gaslighting, because what we found is that we've all been gaslit. Museum professionals at historic museums tend to not treat sports the same way they treat other topics. They treat sports the way sports museum professionals do. And once I saw that, I was just like, okay, what's really going on here? That even we, the museum professionals who spend our whole lives really digging into how to tell balanced interpretation, we're sort of missing this. There's something bigger happening here. And that nugget is really the cultural gaslighting. That answer is that we've all sort of bought into something that we're still trying to figure out. Kind of breaks the brain a little bit to think about it, actually. And I just can't seem to stop looking at that. It's the short answer.
So Kathryn, Heather is absolutely right when she says that I could talk about this all day. This is such a fascinating subject, and so near and dear and to my heart, and I have so many stories that I want to share. I'm curious though, for you as a person who found your way to this niche of interpretation, in part because you're a sports fan, taking off the fan hat and putting on the interpretation hat, what are the recommendations that you have for the museum field going forward in this area of interpretation?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start by saying that the field is disparate. We found that there's like three main factions of this field, and they don't tend to work all together all the time. They kind of work in their own industries. So there's the public historians who run historical museums and all types of different ways that public historians work, sports historians who are in the academy, and then sports museum professionals. Often, two of those things are often not found in the same person. Sometimes they are, often they're not. And so the first thing I'll say is that we sort of see a coming together of the field of these three pieces, to get together and have a conversation together and begin to really like join forces and understand what's really going on here, and begin to look at how we can transform the the sports museum conversation kind of bottom to top. How do we get inside of this conversation? We have lots of great models that have come before us. The Historic House Museum sector, the Sites of Enslavement Museum sector have really just spent the last 20 to 40 years reimagining and revamping the way they interpret those topics. So it's out there for us to learn. And I think coming together to begin to have those conversations is incredibly important. We need to know there's a lot of great work happening out there. There really, really is. And the time is now. Like the public is ready. The conversations have been happening and bubbling now for a good while. And the work is available to do to start to tell some different stories in different ways. Break down that barrier that we believe that sports and politics are not interconnected. They've always been connected. That's never changed. They used to be so connected that it was inherent. People just knew it. And we've sort of convinced ourselves that's not true, but it's still true. It's still completely true. For us, what that means is we work with, in this context, we work with all kinds of different clients that do this work from different angles. So you're looking at sports museum professionals that are literally in sports museums or in sports business in some capacity, that are telling their story outwardly, and it might be expressly for marketing purposes, but that's okay. That you can do that and be authentic. There's a way to do that. And so bring that authenticity to it. For museum professionals of all kinds, we had an art museum exhibit come out. It was Walter Yost images at Houstonic Museum of Art at Houstonic Community College. And they had the collection, and they were art museum professionals and wanted us to bring in our sports expertise to curate it and organize them and put a framework around it. And so any topic from any angle, a children's museum, a historical site, an art museum can look at the principles that we lay out about inclusivity, education, looking at those invested identities, really engaging your audience. These different pillars we lay out. We've got a sort of roadmap. We call it a game plan in our book, Interpreting Sports at Museums and Historic Sites. And that's the kind of the premise the business is built on. And I think any museum wanting to do sports from any angle can take those principles and really look at how to dig a little deeper under that topic. And that's the key, is look at the historical record, get solid facts and information, begin to expand your own thinking about where sports reside in our culture, and then begin to really look at the invested identities and bring them to the table, start to have bigger conversations to really broaden our scope and our view of what sports is and what it can be and how we can have a healthier relationship with it as a country and enjoy it, more, because they can be so much fun.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathryn Leann Harris. And where can we find you? Where can others find you on your socials after the podcast?
Great. Yeah, you can find us on the web, Instagram and Facebook at Interpreting Sports. Interpretingsports.com is the website. So that's our home base. And then you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Interpreting Sports. You can also find us on the conference circuit for museums, and just like out and about, look for us. We're doing things. We got an events page on our website that'll tell you kind of what's popping up at different times. We do webinars and that are open to the public, and we go to conferences that are, a little more in our profession. But we're out there, and we'll look for us in your local museums. You never know where our work might pop up.
And maybe next year in Virginia Beach at the NAI conference.
Yeah, maybe.
No pressure.
I would love it.
Thank you so much for being here, Kathryn. It's really been a pleasure to listen to your stories and your journey, and I'm looking forward to learn more. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to NAI and the work that you guys are doing and the depth that you look at these really, the really important topics of our lives. So thank you for inviting me to be a part of that conversation.
And interpreters,
And interpreters,
that's what's up.